The format that you're going to use is going to be an eighth of a sheet of the larger sheet that you actually were given. So here's a quarter size, and it will be folded and torn in two. And this is the size that we're going to work with. And from this, on this sheet of paper, what I want to do is to draw those 4 columns nice and evenly spaced. So here's how we do it. I'm going to start off with my handy dandy tracing paper, because tracing paper, it allows you to do it ever you want without any fear of making a mistake, because it's not in good yet. So I'm going to trace out the outline, and this is just for practice that I'm doing this. Just trace out the outline of your format of that eighth of the size of a sheet, like so. All right, so let's just put this aside because this is a good sheet of paper and we want to do our very best on it. But here's our practice sheet. I'm going to take this sheet and eventually create those 4 columns, but in a very specific size and a very specific layout on this page. And I said that we're going to have a bottom margin and a top margin, and those columns will be centered within that format. So let's find the center. Very simply, take one corner and draw to the next corner, and by virtue of these diagonals, and even in this you're practicing your line control as well, and they might be a bit wonky, no problems, just erase and start again. But now I have the center of my page. So just drawing very lightly, these are just construction lines, and you don't want them to be too dark because they'll end up in your finished drawing. So you decide on how big your margin is going to be, but let's kind of eyeball it, basically about an inch, inch and a quarter, and that's going to be my top margin. Now you don't have to eyeball it down here, because what happens is I can draw that line, and again we're going to practice our line control, and I'm going to draw a vertical line parallel to that line right there. So from here, draw that vertical line towards you, and where it hits those diagonals, what I can do is just draw another guideline. These are very light lines, these guidelines. Just draw a guideline, and that's where it hits on that diagonal will create a space between the top and bottom of the pages, which are equal. So that's a nice little trick. And I'm going to draw again. This is now going to be the bottom extent of those columns. So the columns will fall here, and this is where they will start. Okay, so now the idea of this is that once we have basically our top and bottom margins in here, and we have the center of our page, what we want to learn how to do is space out those columns so that they are evenly spaced. So give yourself a measure. So for me, what I'm going to do is take this distance of my thumb and eyeball it so it looks like it's center from the knuckle there to the tip of my thumb. All right, that's my designated measure now. And very lightly draw yourself a line. And because we want 4 columns, there'll be 2 columns on one side of the center line and the other 2 on the other side, obviously. So that's how we're going to end up with our columns. 1 column, 2 column, 3 column, and 4 column. So I've got my measure, there's my center, there was my thumb right there. And I'm going to take that same measure, and that measure will form the measurement for the rest of my columns. So right here, between here and here, is my next column, but very lightly draw that down. And now I'm representing the space between those columns. So tip of the thumb to the knuckle, and this becomes my other column right here. So I'm going to darken these lines here. Nice firm control of my hand, no different than practicing from before, but you're going to get much more practice. And I'll darken that one, otherwise the margin and the space between these columns gets kind of confusing. So I'm just going to darken this up. And you can see I'm using one pencil for all of this. Just makes it easier. I'm not really switching out pencils at all. And I know how to control that pencil. I know how to make it very thin and very light, and I can make it very dark as well. Okay, so this is the start of my next column. So if you're confident enough, you can just draw a nice dark line to begin with. And all of these lines should be parallel. The thickness of the columns should be as thick as the space in between. So again, there's my spacing right there, the tip of my thumb to the knuckle, And I'm going to draw that dark because I've got pretty good control of that, and draw that dark and that dark. And if you don't have good control quite yet, because you will develop it, there's my next one here, do go lightly first. Just go light first. Give yourself, and if you kind of floof it up and you don't get it right, well then just draw another line over it until you're satisfied with the line that you're actually going to use. And then I got to remember though, it wasn't actually on that tip, it's right there, so I'm going to extend that line. And there's the other edge of my column right there. And I'll darken that up. So now I have 4 columns, and these columns are now going to form the field in which to practice the various line exercises. Okay, so now we're going to draw within these columns. And we're going to be very specific about what it is that we're going to be drawing in these columns. And again, we're going to be practicing our lines. And we're going to be practicing our lines with various tools. So we're going to be using a 0.2 fine liner. We'll be using 2H, HB, and a 6B lead. We're going to see just what we get out of a hard and a soft lead. You can use the pencil of your choice, and we're going to do a few little things in here. So eventually what this will end up looking like is, it'll look better than this, but the idea of it is we're going to take a column, we'll divide it into 6, and we'll have that column go from light to dark. And we're going to just see what will be the best tool and what is the best way to draw lines to achieve that. The first thing that we're going to do, however, just to kind of make it a little bit interesting, is we're going to draw in this column, we're going to draw with the opposite hand. So normally I draw with this hand, and now I'm going to switch over to this hand, which is a little discombobulating, but boy, does it ever help in refreshing your brain and making you really stay on the page. So in this first column, you're going to draw as carefully as you can with your opposite hand, all the way down. So just some nice controlled lines, and those lines you'll try to keep as close together without crossing over and leaving a nice even space in between. And as you concentrate on doing this, it's amazing how you forget about all your problems because you're concentrating so hard. Okay, so you'll continue on doing that. This next column over here, and these 3 columns, in fact, we're going to divide them into 6 separate blocks, and we're going to use various tools within each of those. So here's how we divide it into 6. Already we know that that's the center of our page, which makes it the center of our column. So from this point, I'm going to draw a very light line, still construction lines. They're just going to serve as guides for each of the columns. Now for each of the columns, we want to divide these into 3. So this half into 3, this half into 3, and that gives us 6 various blocks within there. So the trick for dividing something into 3 is this. And I'm only going to use one block because once I've done that, I'll use this block and then that block, because once I've divided this into 6, I'll just use those guidelines for the rest of the columns over there. So here's the trick to divide something into 3. Our magic diagonals, and I'm going to redraw that one, wasn't very careful, and our next one here, very lightly. And now you have the center, so take that center up and just make a light little mark and draw a diagonal line from the center point of that region down to that corner. Now where this line crossed that diagonal, that forms the third, right? Like so. So that is 1/3 of that width right there. And you can do it on the opposite side here. So I'm always going from a corner, from going from a center to a corner. And where it hit that diagonal is another 1/3. So these lines here are nice equal thirds within that range. So I'm going to take that and then draw from there the rest. And you see how lightly I go, and I go dark a bit because that's going to form a guide for me for the drawing exercise. So those have been broken into thirds. And I can do the same treatment on this column or any of these columns. I want to break that up into thirds. So rather than just eyeballing it, rather than measuring it, we'll do it this way. And the beauty of doing it this way is that it really does help later on when we're designing, when we need to work with our proportions to determine how thin or thick things are going to be. So there's a third there. Again, from center to corner, where it hit that diagonal is where I draw that line. And these now form the guide. I'll just keep drawing my hand down, lighter, 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 a little darker here, lighter here, darker here. And if you get nicely practiced, you don't even have to continue that line. Just keep your hand moving. You're not doing this, you're dragging your hand all the way along, and it keeps that nice and even. So success, you've now broken it up into 6 regions of one column. So this one, we're going to use our fine liner here. We're going to start off in this first section, and we're going to divide it into 4 separate lines. So there's one line. I've broken it into 2. I'm now going to break that into 2 more, and those are all the lines I'm going to draw there. This next one, I'm going to double the density of those lines. So between here and here, I'm going to draw a line, and here I'm going to draw a line. Between here and here, I draw a line. So what you can see is I'm just doubling up on the intensity as I draw these lines down, and this last one right here. So we're going to keep that going all the way down. I'm now going to half it through here, and you're just going to get more and more practice in developing controlled and very disciplined lines. And now what's happening is you're taking control and your lines aren't wandering. So you're also developing your eye, which is a necessary thing for learning how to draw well and accurately. And if you goof up, no worries. At least you're practicing, at least you're doing. Now I'm getting a little bit more dense, so I'm going to just pay really close attention to those lines, and I'm looking at all of those lines there, and oops, I think I missed a halfway point there, but we're going to keep going halfway. So as you can see, what's happening is this region of that column is now getting darker. So halfway, and I made a little goof there, but I don't worry about it. I'm going to keep on going. The other thing that's really key is starting and stopping your line exactly where the end of that region starts and where it stops. So halfway in between and all the way down. And then when I get to the next section, it's going to be very difficult to go halfway. So I'm just going to increase the density and try to do it evenly so that when I get to the bottom of the page, I can end up with basically a black region, a nice dark region, like so. So you can tell I've had a little bit of coffee, nice little wiggle in my line. And now I'm just going to get darker, and we're going to go halfway, and I can see now that I'm just going to, in order to make this one darker than the one above it, I'm really going to have to get a lot more dense. So that's what we're doing there, and then the next square will be completely black, as much as you possibly can. And this is all with the exact same pencil that we're using. I'm going to take away that white space there, and that's going to create a nice gradation of hatching using just one tool. So carry on for all of that one. This next one here, we're going to take our 2H lines, and we're going to go from very thin, this one will be 2H, and if you want to break this guy up into 3, using our trick, because we're going to use 3 different pencils. There's our third, and I'm just going to draw that straight across to that other diagonal, and you're guaranteed to have a third. So there's my thirds. In this region, I'm going to take my 2H pencil, and as I go down, I'm going to try to make it as dark as I can so that when I end up here, I'm getting the most out of that pencil in terms of its darkness. So nice and close lines, because what you're doing is you're gaining control. So light here, and your pencil should be good and sharp. And as you go down, you're going to make it thicker and darker. And what you're going to find with that 2H lead is it's very different than your HB lead, or your H, or your B, whichever one you choose, but within that range. So here I'm going to once again start off light, and I'm going to put more pressure on my pencil as I go through each region and try to get a nice gradual line that goes from thin to thick or light to dark. And again, thin or light, you're basically just brushing the paper there, and as you get darker through there. And then your next one will be a 6B, and I realize I have to really keep these pencils sharp, so I'm going to make sure they're always sharpened. A nice tip on that, because then you can get more out of that pencil. So here's my 6B, and it is so soft. I barely even have to touch the paper, and I get a dark line out of it. And I'm going to see just how much I can get out of that as I get darker. So what you're going to see at the end of this is across this region here, it's going to be fairly light in terms of the darkness. And by the time you get over to here, you get a lot of really great black out of that. In this column over here, you can take now the pencil that you love, and you're going to create some hatching. And two ways of doing this, but I'm going to use here, I'll use the 2H pencil. No, I'm going to use the HB. What you'll want here is a nice gradual hatching. So again, here's my example here. So it's going to go from dark all the way to white. Here's what I'm going to do though for that is on this one, I'm going to establish just how black I want it. I'm using a cross hatch here, and this is just a really common method for hatching. And I'm being very careful to go from one end to the other. And you can see my little wiggle with my pencil, nice control. So that's how dark I want it. And I might even make it darker by just adding a few more lines in there. Midway, however, between one of these, I only want it to be half as dark. And these will now form the guide for you in terms of now how much darker you're going to be here and how much lighter you're going to be here. So if I now just go, my grays are now going to be like this. You now have a sense of, okay, this guy's got to be just that much darker, but not as dark as the one below. So just getting that nice gradual darkness. And I think now I could probably go a little bit lighter here, or maybe even a little bit darker. But the idea of it is to end up with squares that are nicely gradated. And just keep going doing that. But this time, you'll do it on your good sheet. This paper responds very differently than your tracing paper. So when you have it all complete on here, I want you to take your fine liner, because it's nice and small, and just label very carefully. You can call this left hand. I'm using small letters. We can call this fine liner. We can call this one various leads. And this one we can call hatching. And there's your finished work. Once it's complete, that is.